David, do you want to start off? We had talked about that, so
yes, okay, yes. I'll briefly introduce myself and then say 2 or 3 sentences by way of a contextual presentation, really. So my name is David G. I'm now retired. For the last 16 years before I retired, a decade ago, I was a senior advisor on science policy and emerging issues at the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. And amongst other things there, I produced 2 volumes of a publication called Late Lessons from Early Warnings, which basically summarized the history of about 35 hazardous agents, from the first scientifically plausible early warning to a great deal of knowledge, and then the reaction of societies to that knowledge. Did they act early enough or too late? And what were the consequences, the costs and benefits, and pros and cons, and lessons for the future? Amongst those, for example, were 2 very illustrative examples that provide context for us here. The first was asbestos, where the first scientific early warning was 1898. It gets banned around about 1990 or the year 2000 in the case of the EU. And over that period of time, it accumulated much tragedy. So currently in the UK, even though we banned asbestos in 1990, we have about 5,000 new cases of asbestos cancers per year. We're aiming to try and not repeat that history with EMF. Another case study that's of more direct relevance is the history of X-rays, discovered 1895, first acute effects 1896, first chronic cancer effects in the mid-20s amongst the radiographers who were performing the X-rays. First attempt really to regulate this area comes in the late 1930s and perhaps encapsulated in 1948-49, when the International Commission on Radiological Protection was set up. And that produced 3 or 4 principles which are of direct relevance to this area we're discussing today, which is non-ionizing radiations of electromagnetic fields. The 3 principles were: first, justify the use of an agent which has no known safe level being carcinogenic. So don't put it into trivial items like X-rays in shoe shops in the 1950s, which was done, but later banned. Banned under the justification principle. Second, if you do bring in a hazardous agent like ionizing radiations, X-rays, please try and, through engineering controls, reduce exposures as much as possible. And thirdly, when you're using them in practice on a daily basis, apply the 3rd principle, as keep exposures as low as is reasonably achievable. Many of us feel that in this field of non-ionizing radiations that Kent will discuss today, we should be applying those very same, very useful principles from the field of ionizing radiations. The last thing to say is there is a big difference of opinion, a divergent evaluation of the same scientific evidence concerning electromagnetic fields, with in one corner an organization excuse me, called ICNIRP, which Kent will explain, and in the other the ICBE-EMF, the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, which is financing Kent's trip over here and which is providing us with a lot of support. Both of us are connected to ICBE. When those 2 bodies look at essentially the same evidence, they come to very, very different conclusions. This is very, very common in science. The most extreme example right now is coming from the 2 European bodies responsible for looking after the hazards of a common chemical called BPA. The European Medicines Agency says that the existing exposure limit is fine. The European Food Standards Agency has just said 6 months ago the exposure limit should be reduced by 23,000 times. So those 2 bodies had to meet very recently to produce a very short report just telling us and making transparent how it is that honest scientists can look at essentially the same evidence and come to very, very divergent evaluations. So this is not a new phenomena, and we can all learn from these other examples. That's enough for me. Kent, I want to introduce. We have been on a UK and EU roadshow for the last week, involving about 8 or 9 presentations altogether. And he will be presenting the essence of the recommendations from the New Hampshire Commission on 5G. He was one of 13 experts on that commission and has an interesting story to tell. Over to you, Kent.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. And good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me. I know that I'm going through a sound system, electronic sound system that can distort the voice. And I know I'm speaking with a strange accent. So I'll do my best to get my message across. And that message starts in my entire career. For my entire career, I've been studying the effects, studying electromagnetic waves, radio waves. I mean, I've climbed towers early in my career, making measurements on active antennas. I've made lots of measurements in the field. I've worked with electromagnetic equipment that has caused me to be radiated. And I even designed an antenna to be used inside the human body so it could get communications for an implanted device and to harvest energy. So obviously, I did not think there was harm associated with electromagnetic fields. Although I did hear that you probably wouldn't want to hold a phone up to your head for long periods of time over many years, but I thought that was a very small risk. But then about 4 years ago, I was asked to serve on a commission, a formal state commission, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And I learned a lot of things. One is about the harm of radiation exposure, and that is the bad news. Yes, the wireless radiation that you get from your cell phones, cell towers, or all digital devices can harm you. But if we acknowledge that harm, there's a lot we can do to lower the radiation from those devices and make them reasonably safe to use. So I will be talking about my journey on that commission and share with you its findings and how we came to our conclusions. So in order to do that, I'll be sharing slides with you. I hope you can see them. And if not, I would encourage you to move closer to the screen because I know how frustrating it is to look at a presentation and be squinting your eyes trying to read what's on the slides. So having said that, let's move to my slides, which I'm assuming that you can see now.
Yes, we do.
Fantastic. Thank you for letting me know. And again, I'm here on behalf of the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields that David mentioned. I'm also here as a faculty member from the University of New Hampshire in the United States. And since I'm reporting on a state commission, I have their logo up there as well. So I'm going to jump right into my content, and that content involves that New Hampshire Commission on the Health and Environmental Impacts of 5G and Wireless Technology. So the first question you may be asking is, why did they form the commission to begin with? Well, our legislators are very busy. As I'm finding out, legislators are busy throughout the country and the world. Sometimes they will have 1,000 pieces of legislation, like 1,000 bills to evaluate and vote on in every session, every legislative session. And that was the case for our legislators in New Hampshire. Well, why the commission? Well, they were hearing, the legislators were hearing from the people in the telecommunications industry that wireless radiation is completely harmless, and we needed to bring more wireless facilities into our state in order to be competitive. So that's what they were hearing from the people in the telecommunications industry. Yet they were hearing from their constituents that, no, we are being harmed by wireless radiation, and we have the science to prove it. Well, the legislators didn't have the time to go into it themselves, so they said, well, let's form a commission to look at it. And that's the commission I served on. So in order to form a commission in our state, you have to, you have to convene it through legislation. So this is not just something really small. In other words, you can't simply say, oh, I want to form a commission. You have to form legislation for that commission. That legislation has to get voted on by both houses of our legislature, and it has to be signed by the governor. So that is what happened in New Hampshire. If you want to read the legislation that formed the commission, I think it's 5 or 6 pages, and I'll talk a little bit about what that legislation looked like that formed the commission, because it gave us our marching orders. It told us what we should look at and what we should do in order to answer the question, is wireless radiation harmless? That was the key question. So this is the first time in the United States that a commission like ours was formed, although I am happy to report that there are 3 other states, Maine, Massachusetts, and New York, that are forming, or they currently have legislation to form a similar commission. In the final analysis, we ended up with 13 commission members. About 10 of us were scientific in our background. And as you can see here, we had backgrounds in, if you will hold on a moment, I got a cursor here that's covering everything. Yeah. We had expertise in medicine. We had 2 medical doctors on our commission. We had people in physics, toxicology, electromagnetics. I think you can see where you would need somebody who understood electromagnetics if you're going to be looking at wireless radiation, and that was my job. Epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health, public health policy. The bottom line is that we had people with the expertise to answer the questions that were being posed to us. Well, what were those questions? Well, and you've heard these before, but these questions were built into the legislation. Asking questions like, why does the insurance industry recognize wireless radiation as a risk, but it won't insure for damages against it? So why have there been many hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing harm from wireless radiation, and they have been ignored by FCC and ICNIRP? Why are the guidelines, the current ICNIRP FCC guidelines, based solely on thermal effects, on heating, when other effects have been documented? Now, I'll talk more about how the standards were set, the thresholds for radiation exposure. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And finally, there were other questions being posed to the commission, but these are just 4 that I thought I would show you. Why did the World Health Organization classify wireless radiation as a possible carcinogen? And why is it being ignored by ICNIRP? So we had questions that we were supposed to ask and answer in the commission. The commission went on for a year, and I'll tell you what we looked at in order to find things out. So the sources of information for our commission are as follows. In fact, I'll pose this as a question to you. Say you have an area of expertise, and I imagine a lot of you do. And let's say then you were asked to serve on a commission that involved your area of expertise, but involved a lot more things. Where would you go first? What would you look at to try to answer the questions and get a better understanding of the material, of the topic in general? So we evaluated peer-reviewed and commission-vetted publications. In other words, we went to the library, started searching to find out what information is there. That's the first thing I did. And I should mention that as a department chair, I've also been an associate editor for IEEE Transactions. I've been an associate editor for a major technical publication. And so I have experience in vetting material to determine if it's valid or not. And I say this to you with recognition that not everything in the peer-reviewed literature is valid. I think most of you know that. So we went through a significant effort to make sure that the peer-reviewed articles that we looked at and used to draw our conclusions were valid, because some aren't. We now wanted to make sure that we were looking at the right publications. So that was a major source of information that we used to come up with our conclusions. We also contacted regulatory agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So we invited them to come talk with us, and we asked them questions. But in the final analysis, none of them showed up. They did not. And they didn't even answer our questions when we posed those questions to them with email. You would think that a formal state commission that was formed through bipartisan legislation, you think we would have some clout with the government, and that turned out not to be the case. We also brought in outside experts. So people recognize, and remember this commission met for over a year, and we brought in 9 experts, people recognized with background knowledge in the relationship between exposure to electromagnetic fields and health. All of them, provided clear evidence that wireless radiation is harmful, all of them but one. And that one presenter who did not acknowledge the risks was the presenter from the telecommunications industry. He was also the only one who was paid to present to our commission. So I think you can see a trend here, one that you're probably already very familiar with, and that is the only people now claiming that there's no harm from wireless radiation are those who are affiliated with the telecommunications industry. Oh, by the way, you might see on that second bullet, regulatory agencies, and I'm listing that as part of the sources of information for our findings. You might come back and say, well, if they didn't meet with you, why are you including them on this list of sources of information? Well, the fact that they did not show up was a major source of information for us. It told us something important. So the outcome of our literature review, after doing studies of hundreds of papers, we did identify hundreds of top-tier publications that show harm from low-level wireless radiation exposure, hundreds of them. So top tier, I mention that because sometimes industry will tell you that the only articles that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe, what they call fringe journals. But right here, this first bullet says that we identified hundreds of top-tier publications that show harm. So definitely not fringe journals. And also, as of 2020, the vast majority of peer-reviewed publications showed harm. So it's not like we're cherry-picking. The vast majority showed harm from exposure. And in fact, over 90% of the studies that looked at free radical formation find that is increased. Free radicals in your body increase as a result of low-level radio frequency exposure. That's like what comes out of your cell phone. I think many of you are familiar with free radicals. Free radicals, they cause oxidation, premature aging, and I have another slide. The next slide talks about some things that can happen as a result of excessive free radicals in your system. We do a lot to try to lower our free radical load, like eating the right foods, for example, blueberries, and taking things like vitamin C that lowers your free radicals. But if you're exposed to wireless radiation, that increases your free radicals, which the International Agency for Research on Cancer has identified oxidative stress as a common characteristic of carcinogens. In other words, they're bad. We don't want them in our body, but exposure to wireless radiation increases them. So here are just some of the diseases associated with an increase in free radicals, and definitely these articles that I have linked here are associated with wireless radiation exposure. I believe that these slides will be made available to you. And if you get these slides in PDF form, you can click on any of the links here and they'll take you to the sources or to take you to a source of information for a particular topic. For the diseases listed here, there are lots and lots of examples, lots and lots of articles, but to keep things simpler, I'm only linking to one particular source. But as you can see, there are lots of diseases associated with exposure to wireless radiation. Now, here's the part that's very important, perhaps the most important part of my presentation, and certainly had a huge impact on the commission as we sought to make our decisions and draw our conclusions. how the guidelines for exposure are set. These are the guidelines that are in place now. So if the FC or your ICNIRP or your regulatory agency comes out to a particular location, they'll make a reading. The reading time is oftentimes in microwatts per meter squared. They'll compare that reading to the limits that I'm about to share with you, how those limits were determined. And I'll just bring them up as a single slide. And the assumption for the limits that are in place today, the assumption is that if an electromagnetic wave does not heat your cells, does not heat you up like a microwave oven, if it doesn't heat you excessively, it is not harmful at all. And the tests that to come up with the values for that exposure limit, excuse me, please, I have to clear my throat. It's still morning for me. I imagine for you too. So the studies were performed in the early 1980s, as you can see on the slide, and they were based on very short-term measurements, very short-term studies, under an hour. And remember, these are coming up with the standards that are used for lifetime exposures. And they were performed on a relatively small number of animals. As you can see here, 8 rats and 5 monkeys, a total N, a number of subjects of 13, which is, again, pretty amazing. I'm unaware of any other study like this that's been done on such a small number of animals, of subjects. So the way this test worked is they had trained the animals, the rats and monkeys, to push levers to receive food. And then they food deprived the animals and put them in a cage and started radiating them with increasing levels of radiation. Now, in the beginning, the animals were pushing the lever because they were food deprived and they were getting food. But as they continued, the researchers kept continuing to increase the radiation exposure. Finally, the animals couldn't function anymore. They couldn't push the lever. And that then was designated as the threshold dose for radiation, which is kind of crazy. I have to, every time I tell this, I find that I'm kind of shocked by how crude this study was. And so they finally pushed the animals. Now, it was such intense radiation at that point that some of the monkeys got burns on their faces from the radiation. But that was what was designated as the threshold dose. And then they took an arbitrary, what they call a safety factor. It's not a safety factor at all, but they just arbitrarily said, well, if we take that number and divide it by 50, that's a safe dosage for the population in general, but we'll only divide it by 10 for workers. So that is how the limits that you hear about, and also you'll hear about the safety factor from people from groups like ICNIRP and the FCC. Oh, we applied a 50-fold safety factor. It's arbitrary. Usually when you apply a safety factor, you have some expectation about what degree of safety that factor will provide. And in this case, I know of no such analysis to come up with that number. I have to recap this just to make sure that I'm getting through, because I had to see this several times before I could believe it. But how the guidelines were set are as follows. So remember that the guidelines we're talking about that are for lifetime exposures, for your lifetime exposures, 24-hour, 24/7 exposure, are based on the following. Studies that lasted less than an hour or an hour. A single endpoint, the only thing they looked at in this study is whether or not the animals could push the lever. That was it. Usually for a study like this, you have multiple endpoints. You look at other biomarkers. In this case, they said, well, when the animals stop functioning, that's the limit for exposure. That's the threshold dose. A small sample. I've never heard of a study like this with a sample size of 13. It's just kind of unheard of. And then finally, the application of an arbitrary safety factor. So I wanted you to know, and like I say, that's the most important thing, is to know where the guidelines that are in place today, where they came from. This is it. And there's more about it in the paper that we wrote, and it was linked on the previous slide. To give you an example of why the short-term doesn't do any good for you. Why a short-term study doesn't tell you what goes on is because the effects of radiation, I mean, you don't want to heat people up, but the effects tend to happen over a very long period of time, like smoking. Here's an example. And I've got links to this study, but there are lots of studies that are very similar. So starting in 2008, as you can see on the slide, and I hope you can see it, there's an antenna in the left picture. And 142 meters from that antenna is a tree. And in 2008, it looks pretty good. But then over time, going from 2008 to 2015, 7 years later, you can see that there's degradation on the tree. And if you fast forward another 4 years, the tree is in pretty bad shape. And in fact, they had to cut that tree down. This particular study that I'm referencing looked at, I think it was 30 trees, and they found very similar effects time after time. It was the side of the tree that was exposed to the radiation that degraded first, and then finally the entire tree degraded. And one thing I want to point out, and I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but the exposure on the left side of the tree was, I can give the number, 33,380 microwatts per meter squared, which is only 0.03% of the FCC ICNIRP limit. And so the point is here is with very low level, but long-term exposures, you have a deleterious effect, and it's very similar to smoking. You start smoking cigarettes now, you may be fine in the next few years, but we all know now that if you continue smoking for many, many years, it will degrade your health. And that's what's going on with wireless radiation. So in terms of what happens with people, and of course, that's what we're mostly interested in, there have been 38 studies that have been put into a meta-study. A meta-study is where you take previous studies about a particular subject and you combine them together so that you have a greater confidence in the results. And that's what's being displayed here. There was a meta-study of 38 previous studies that looked at the effects of radiation for people living around cell towers. And what they found is that 3/4 of the studies showed effects of radiofrequency sickness. 3/4 of them showed an increase in cancer. 3/4 of them showed changes in your biomarkers. And the studies also showed negative impacts on animals and trees, like I showed in the previous slide, a huge impact on wildlife. And they have a general conclusion is that if you're 500 meters or more from a cell tower, that appears to be a reasonable distance. Reasonable. I'm not going to say safe. I don't know of anybody that really can say the word safe with regards to exposure, as David mentioned earlier, but there is such a thing as reasonable. We want to use our devices, our electronic devices, and I'm currently under the belief that we can, by engineering properly, by siting systems properly, we can come up with something that's reasonable in terms of the harm that occurs. Oops. So we as a commission got to that point where we saw that definitely the existing standards were causing harm or allowing harm to happen. So how come our FCC, our Federal Communications Commission, wasn't doing more to help us? Well, we found this article. This is not some conspiracy theory. This is from the Harvard University Center for Ethics. It was written back in 2015. And the title itself tells what's going on with the FCC, and it explains a little bit about why agencies like the FCC, which are also captured, didn't even want to talk with us. And notice the title here, How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industries It Presumably Regulates. I mean, that does say it all. It's industry. And then, by the way, that graphic there on the left shows a revolving door, because that's what's going on with the FCC. They have people who work in industry and come in and work as in top-level administration within the FCC, and then they go back to industry. And so because of that, they're not going to well, do things to change the way things are currently going. They're very happy with these very high thresholds, exposure thresholds, because it would cost a lot of money and it would change people's relationships with their phone if they lowered those standards. They have to do a lot. It would cost a lot of money to comply with those new standards. So this is what's going on politically. So the conclusions reached, we have our final report. It is 390 pages. Most of it is in the appendices. So if you do choose to click on the link and you see the 390 pages, you could look at perhaps the first 20 pages and get a good sense of what our findings were. And it's very similar to what I just am, or I'm what I'm presenting now. The first bullet here is wireless radiation, which includes 5G. That's something that I didn't mention before. And that is, when I talk about wireless radiation, that includes cell phones, cell towers, baby monitors, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. We found that there wasn't enough research to separate them. There may be slight differences in how they impact the human body and health and the environment, but they all do. They all do have negative impacts. So that's why we lumped it together. Wireless radiation in general, and just happen to say that it does include 5G, does pose a significant health threat. Electro hypersensitivity, and I suspect that some of you out there do have EHS. You may prefer a different word to describe your condition, but this is the one. EHS is one that's generally used. We as a commission recognize that it is real. It's not all in your heads. It's a real illness, and it is caused by wireless radiation exposure. Another thing, and that made it frustrating for us as a commission, this is not solely a scientific issue. It's a political and economic one. And that's very hard to overcome. And you'll see in our recommendations, we're advocating for political changes, but because it is such of a political and economic issue, it's hard to get things done. We also acknowledge that until the ICNIRP and the FCC guideline policies, in particular, you may have heard of it because you have similar policies in Europe, our Telecommunications Act of 1996, particularly Section 704, it says it really limits what people can do to limit their exposure to wireless radiation. So we're just simply saying there in our conclusions, in our final report, that we need to change that. We need to empower people to protect themselves against wireless radiation. And finally, I have this list of recommendations. I'm not going to go to them in detail. The first bullet, and by the way, looking back on this, these are correct recommendations for us to make, but they're perhaps a little bit naive. One thing that I think that you all have seen also, is that in making political change, making change in general, you probably are going to have the least luck when you go to the federal level, because things seem to be controlled by other mechanisms there and not by the people. So if you want to make changes, you go to the grassroots level. And I have stories about that I could tell, because that's the only place I've really been seeing change occur. So we had said, issue this resolution to the United States Congress. We've tried to make action, to get action through our federal delegation, but we've had very little luck. It's not a sexy issue. Protecting people is not a sexy issue. And also there are huge moneyed interests that don't want to see any change happen. And since it is the moneyed interests that make things happen politically, I realized that was not the right approach to take. We also thought we could engage agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency. Aren't they supposed to regulate toxins? Well, we've had very little luck there too, as you can imagine. We wanted to, and this is something that we did pursue, is we put in, or we came up with legislation to mandate setbacks for new cell towers. We said that new towers had to be put in at least 500 feet away from where people live and work. So we wrote the legislation, we promoted it, and we did not get very far with it. A lot of the legislators say, oh, this is a great idea, but it's not going to pass because the lobbyists, the industry, isn't going to let that happen. We also thought that there should be free radiation, low radiation zones in public buildings. People need a refuge. If you're being exposed and you're experiencing EHS symptoms, there needs to be a place to go. And we also, in this last bullet, felt that our agencies, our government, should be helping to provide the types of education that you're getting right now. People need to understand the risks, the harms of radiation exposure, because what I found, and perhaps what you found, is once people understand that this radiation is not harmless, they start doing things about it in their personal lives, and there's a lot that can be done. So my concluding remarks to you are a formal state commission of unbiased experts. None of us were paid to serve. We had no affiliations with the telecommunications industry except for the reps from that industry that served on the commission. We concluded that low-level microwave radiation is harmful to human health and the environment. And also that technological development should be pursued. ICBE has a paper describing things that can be done to cell phones to make them radiate a lot less. There are low radiation routers that can be used. So your Wi-Fi in your home, Wi-Fi in schools can be made a lot lower in terms of radiation. Engineers like me, when we designed these systems, we were never told to design them with lower radiation in mind. We were only told to make them as fast as possible, which means that you have a lot of radiation. I'm a very big proponent based upon what I've seen, and I'm speaking for the commission to do more with fiber. Fiber is the future. It is future-proof. It's always going to work for you. And I have stories about that, but it's secure. It's far more green. It does not radiate. So I'm really an advocate. So I imagine there are some advocates for fiber optics out in the audience. And here's my final closing message, and this is not only from me, but from the commission in general, and that is those in a position to do so are strongly encouraged to enact protections against microwave radiation, wireless radiation, which includes delaying the rollout of 5G in its present form. So that concludes my presentation, and I thank you for your attendance.
What's the next step about ICBE? Or is it just created and you're still working on it?
Kent?
Well, and we have Elizabeth Kelly on the line also, and she may wish to chime in. But the reason, so I'll talk about my relationship with ICBE, and then hand it over to you, Libby, because I think that you're going to say more than I do. So this is an organization that was formed. I joined ICBE after serving on the commission because I served on the commission for a year. We came out with the final report, and then what? I was looking for a way to continue to spread the message of the commission I served on. And the way, by joining ICBE, I joined fellow scientists, and Libby perhaps can talk about the other scientists that are on the commission. And we've done things like write 2 papers at this point. ICBE has been in place of a year and a half. And in that time, we've come up with 2 papers, one that addresses the faulty assumptions of ICNIRP in setting the standards. In fact, I gave a very brief overview of how the standards were set. Well, ICBE wrote a paper headed by Ron Melnick, that addressed on a point-by-point basis all of the assumptions that are wrong with what ICNIRP did to set the standards. We also came up with that paper that I mentioned at the end of my presentation about ways to make cell phones safer. Please note that I didn't use the word safe. How to lower radiation. We can do a tremendous reduction in radiation exposure if we just admit that the problem is there. So for me, being part of ICBE has been an opportunity to continue the work of the commission. And the fact that you have eminent people on the commission really reinforces the impact that we can have in making change. So, Libby, as you've heard what I just said, would you like to add to that?
Oh, Kent, you did a great job. Hello, everybody. I've been in the background just enjoying Kent's presentation and David's introduction. Thank you so much. But since I am now seen by everybody, I'll just go ahead and tell you a little about ICBE. As Kent said, we are an international organization. We are interdisciplinary. Our purpose is to look at the science and provide scientifically based evidence-based advice to the World Health Organization, to the national governments, to anybody that'll listen, frankly. But our goal is to find solutions to the problem of polarization, really, in the scientific community. There are scientists that have grown up as been trained in physics and not biology, or as a medical doctor, but they never took a course on bioelectromagnetics. So these professional categories are not exposed to electromagnetics at all. And here they are doing their work, thinking they're doing the right thing, and they need some education. So we are trying to breach that by our papers, by the information we provide directly to the public, to you and elsewhere, to raise awareness and promote these changes, such as the ones that Kent just laid out coming from the New Hampshire 5G Commission. So we represent in our group hundreds of years of experience in publishing papers on electromagnetic fields. And if you go to our website, ICBE-EMF.org, you can see who the members are, and you can read their list of publications, their biographical statements. You can look at our first two publications. We have some graphic materials in there to break it down for you and explain what the papers signify. I know that scientific papers are very hard to read. In fact, the scientists themselves often just read the abstracts. So we're doing our best to break this down and make it consumer friendly as well. So, and by the way, I wish you good luck in forming your new organization. It's nice to see you here. Thank you.
So that was really great to have you online. So thanks for your time. I understood you have a very busy day. You're at Oxford, right, Kent, today?
I have another presentation coming up in just a bit.
Yeah, okay.
I'm meeting with a group that helps make the decisions for ICNIRP, or helps provide information for ICNIRP.
Okay.
So I'm hoping to become involved with that group. I'm going to be presenting to them our commission's finding in hopes that it will sway some people to be a little bit more open-minded about other approaches, other ways of looking at the exposure harm issue.
Oh, right. Well, we wish you the best. That's given, of course. And just know that we are a lot of people that suffer from EMF, and we all see your initiative with great hope, because, well, of course, we need scientists to stand up and explain things in a very easy way like you do. So please continue this fight, and we'll be very happy to follow and see how it evolves, and if needed, we may help with trying to convince politics or at national level or even EU level at our own side. Many thanks.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much. All the best to you all. I'm going to sign off now to go to my next meeting.
So it is time we say bye-bye to our online guests. Ciao, ciao.